Now we're going to talk about something in between a monopoly and a competitive market called monopolistic competition. So first, let's talk about its characteristics. First, there are many sellers and there are many buyers. So all of our different market characteristics have had a lot of buyers, but the numbers of sellers vary. So it's similar to perfect competition in its level of, or in its look of its market, but one difference here is that they are going to be price searchers and not takers, meaning they'll be able to look at the demand curve for their good and pick their preferred price and quantity combination from that demand curve. The reason for this being they have heterogeneous products. So that means their products are not identical. So with perfect competition, all of the products were the same, right? Like an ear of corn was an ear of corn. But now these products are not going to be the same. So I like to think of a fast food hamburger, right? They're all hamburgers. They all often have fairly similar ingredients and toppings on them. But if you were to put a burger from McDonald's next to one from Burger King next to one from Cookout, you could probably tell them apart, especially if one of those was your favorite. You would know exactly when you saw it which one was the best one. So they're all hamburgers, but they're not the same thing. And so this is easy entry and exit because there's no barriers. So fast food is a very good example here because legally it's pretty easy to open a restaurant. There certainly are different health things that you have to follow, but there's no thing that's keeping you from opening one like there would be with the legal restrictions or the issues that you would face if you were trying to enter a monopoly market, right? So there's relatively no barriers, no more than there would be to becoming a farmer, right? There are certain things you have to follow, but not too much. So this is the basic characteristics of a monopolistically competitive firm. So it's similar to perfect competition in that there's lots of people and there's low barriers to entry, but it's similar to monopolies because they have different products, thus the term monopolistic competition. So now that we've talked about how to find a monopolistically competitive firm and identify one, let's look at how their demand curve is shaped. Because the demand curve for a perfectly competitive firm and monopoly were completely different, and that led to them having profits or not having profits in the long run, and all sorts of things. So, for a perfect competition, we saw that they had endless substitutes, so their demand was perfectly elastic. Right, so if we were to sketch their demand curve, it looked like that. A monopoly, however, had no rivals and no close substitutes, so they had a very low elasticity of demand. It's very inelastic. So their demand curve was relatively steep, like that. So where is a monopoly? Monopolistic competition, excuse me. Well, the short answer is somewhere between those. So let's look at why. First, they do have many rivals, right? There's a lot of different people making that hamburger, but that's not the same hamburger. So since they don't sell the same thing, that's going to impact how it looks like. So since it's not the same thing, that means demand is not perfectly elastic. They're substitutes, however, but they're not perfect. So because there are some substitutes, that means that it's not going to be as inelastic as a monopoly. And so the demand curve faced by a monopolistically competitive firm is downward sloping, which is good because demand curves in general are downward sloping. They're not upward at least. But it's also not going to be as steep as a monopoly. So it's somewhere between these two pictures up here. It's not flat, but it's also not super steep. And so for a perfectly, oh, so not perfectly, excuse me, for a monopolistically competitive firm to sell a mother unit, they are going to have to lower the price. So that means, again, we can see what's happening to the marginal revenue, determine if they are price searchers or price takers, just as we could before. So for example, if you can sell 3 units at $10 a piece, in order to sell 4 units, you're going to have to lower it to $9 a piece for all of the units. So they're still choosing a single price as they were with a monopoly. It's just the demand, the curve they're choosing their price from is shaped a little different. So now it would be important to talk about the optimum and what the graph looks like for a monopolistically competitive firm. So just like for all firms, they're going to seek to where their marginal revenue is equal to their marginal cost, right? That's the goal for all firms, no matter the structure. So for a monopolistically competitive firm, they have downward sloping demand. It probably looks a little something like that. They have a marginal cost curve. And then their demand also generates a marginal revenue curve. Looks roughly the same, is likely to fall at the same rate. I would give you the equation in this case because marginal revenue and demand's a little weird here compared to the other. But in general, it starts at the same point and falls faster than the demand curve. Where those two intersect gives you how many the perfectly competitive firm makes, and you go up to the demand curve to get the price they want to charge. So this picture looks essentially just like a monopoly, except that its demand curve isn't super steep. So otherwise, the pictures look the same. So it's important to remember that the price they're going to charge is the maximum someone would pay for the quantity produced, meaning you've got to go back up to the demand curve. You can't stop there. Okay. So because they're not at the efficient amount, there is still a deadweight loss associated with monopolistically competitive firms. Because of the shape of their demand in general, it's going to be smaller than it would be with a monopoly, but it really just depends. Okay. One of the big differences here are going to be profits. So we found that both monopolies and perfectly competitive firms could have profits in the short run. So that's definitely a possibility here. Right? As long as their price is above their average total cost, they're going to be making profits. The question is, can you have profits in the long run? Because with perfectly competitive firms, because it was so easy for companies to come in and open up whenever it was a profitable area to be in, those profits would be whittled away from competition and you'd have zero profits in the long run. You'd also wouldn't have losses, so that part was good. Whereas with a monopoly, because no people could enter, they were going to be able to keep their profits in the long run. So the key here is the fact that entry is still relatively easy for monopolistically competitive firms. So that means if there's going to be positive profits, people are going to enter. And when they enter, this means our profits will fall. And if there's negative profits, then firms will leave, and that'll make losses fall. And so again, there's going to be zero profit in the long run. Right. But because our products are different, what happens as firms enter is our demand curve for the specific product gets flatter and flatter, right? Because it's the fact that the demand curve isn't perfectly elastic is where they're getting their strength. And as more people enter, or as people are convinced that that product no longer is special, they're not as willing to pay for it more than they would another one. And so the elasticity gets less and less inelastic, more elastic. So this isn't saying exactly how I want to. So when firms enter, the demand, let's mark this out, flattens. That's what it should be saying. The demand curve flattens. And so now, how can you keep that from happening? Well, there's this thing called advertising. So far, there hasn't been really a point in advertising. Because if you're a monopoly, maybe you could make your people feel better about you being a monopoly, and I think that's most of why you see those Duke Energy and other electrical commercials. They make you not want to revolt on the fact that you have a monopoly. But that's really about all they can do. They don't need to convince you to buy from them. And then you also don't see a lot of Farmer Brown's corn ads. You might see Buy American Agriculture, but that's different, right? Because now you're talking a larger scale. But the individual ones, because those farmers are indistinguishable from a purchaser standpoint, there's no point in individual farmer advertising. But what you do see a lot of advertisements for are hamburgers and cars and all sorts of things where the name has a meaning. And so the point of advertising is to keep that demand curve from flattening. So this keeps customers. And it keeps customers by, or not by keeping customers, they're then able to keep the demand steeper. Right? They keep it from going flat, and so they can keep getting profits longer. So they can prolong the long run. So with other firms, because you can't convince people with perfect competition that your product is different, there's no way to keep those profits. They just go away. But here, through advertising, you're able to hopefully convince your customers that they should come to you and not someone else who serves the same but different good. So that allows you to keep profits longer. So if you think about it, most of the advertisements for firms you see, they may be in other market structures, but a lot of them are going to fall in this category of having lots of companies where if you had to list every single person who made it, it's going to be very hard to make that list. However, if you'd be able to come up with a lot of them, but you wouldn't be able to list all of them for monopolistically competitive. Right? Like I couldn't list every fast food restaurant you could get a hamburger at in America. There's way too many, and there's plenty of little local places all across. So that's even in just the local area, it would be hard. So it's hard to list all the companies, but their companies still have meaning. So there's tons of them, but each one has its own meaning. Okay. So I thought it might be helpful to see in sort of one place the different market structures and sort of how they are on a scale from most competitive, so this is going to be the most, to the least. So at the most competitive, we have perfect competition. At the least competitive, we have monopolies. Then monopolistic competition would be around here. And we haven't talked about them yet, but oligopolies are coming. They're going to be more over here, close to monopolies. And then there's all sorts of other different possible levels of competitiveness. Again, we're only talking about competitiveness on the production side. There are types of markets where you don't have tons of buyers, and that changes things, but we're not going to talk about those in this course. That's for a more advanced course. So in our categories here, so if we look at perfect competition, We used example of things like corn, right? So those are going to be lots of different agricultural products, maybe livestock. That would go in that category. I'm not going to talk about every possible market, but that's one. And then in monopolies, we had things like energy and other utilities. Technically, the USPS is one. That one's a little harder. Drug manufacturing, at least for certain times. I'm talking prescription medicines. Okay. Monopolistic competition is going to be, again, things like fast food. It also would be something like clothes, right? Those name brands mean something, and so that goes there. At least for certain clothes. You might be able to convince me that a plain t-shirt belongs over in perfect competition, but even then the fabric sometimes feels different and looks and fits different, so they might not even be. So clothes would be in that category. So again, monopolistic competition is going to be anything that if you were to list off all the possible things that make it, you could list a lot of them, and as you list them, something comes to your mind, like you can picture their product instead of just a general ear of corn. Okay. Oligopolies are where there's really just 2 to 4 main manufacturers. So this would be something like commercial airlines, not airlines, excuse me, jets. There's really only 2 people that make it. It's Boeing and Airbus. Those are your options. So I'm trying to think of other oligopolies that you might be familiar with. I'm going to put cell towers because there's lots of different cell phone carriers, but most of them just buy usage of towers from the main companies. So there's really only a couple companies that provide cell towers. And so in these instances, you should be able to list them because there's only a few of them. Once you start getting to more than 5, it's no longer an oligopoly. It might not be monopolistic competition. It might be in this gray area that we didn't quite talk about. So if we were to put some specific companies places, we would put like Farmer Brown, just as an example, would be like there on our line. If we wanted to add fast food, we might put some type of a local burger joint down here, and then something more recognizable like maybe Chick-fil-A up here. In fact, I usually use Chick-fil-A as an example. I'm surprised I haven't yet, because the whole point of monopolistic competition is you should be able to tell a difference. Like if your friend tells you they're going to go pick you up lunch at Chick-fil-A and they're going to bring you back a chicken sandwich and then they put a McChick in front of you when you come back, that is not the same thing. They did not used to be chickens at the same level of meatiness. Anyways, so they're not quite the same thing. Sometimes that is a perceived difference, sometimes it's not. I would probably put like Coca-Cola here. Actually, that's probably not far enough for them. They're a little closer. So they're technically in what we call a dominant firm competitive fringe situation. So you've got Coke and Pepsi as your main 2 providers, and then there's tons of little tiny generic brands competing for your competition. So they're close to an oligopoly, but they're not quite. So there's that one. Clothes, there's a lot of different clothes people, and this kind of varies from person to person, but many clothing companies are going to be more around that local burger joint. So then commercial jets, because there's only 2 of them, we would put like Airbus here where it's practically a monopoly. There's only one doing it. There's Duke over here. So I'm going to encourage you through your discussion in the coming weeks, as well as your article summary, to look back at this one and think about what makes these companies in their different categories. Because you're going to need to explain why a specific company, one that is not discussed, I realize I discussed a lot of them, but think of a company and explain which of these categories it fits in.